Oji Rose, and today we're going to be talking about believing what we don't believe. This is part of the Hume to Hegel series, the fundamentality of natural belief and our world of paralyzed centipedes and Kafkaesque mice. This is going to be alluding a lot to the paper Deconstructing Common Life from the Conflict of Mind, discussing David Hume according to Donald Livingston in his masterpiece Philosophical Melancholy and Delirium. And we're going to be looking at ways to think about Hume and Hegel together. And one of the key things to think about them both is that the doctrine that all knowledge originates from experience, and that nothing is in the intellect that was not first in sense. This sounds like empiricism or kind of raw empirical observation, but I think we have to think of it more according to what I call phenomenological pragmatism. For Hume, we observe common life, we observe sentiment, we observe the natural ebbs and flows of a community. It's very concrete. No, the fact that if you put a coat on a chair, you can't observe the fact that you shouldn't take that chair in the same way that you can observe a rock, but in the same time, it is concrete. Hume would kind of push back against the idea that social commons, norms, and stuff like that is not concrete. No, it is not concrete the same way as a rock, but thinking that social norms are not concrete at all leads into basically the world turning into a snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros, auto-cannibalism, and Hume warns about these things. And I think we see in Hegel a similar concern that if rationality does not realize absolute knowing, if it doesn't come to incorporate limits into its own thinking and then think according to those limits as those limits being part of its own material, then rationality eats itself. It becomes autonomous rationality. It becomes pathological. And, what we're told by Mr. Livingston, no philosopher has suffered more than the narrowing of vision that comes from the modern habit of epistemological classification than Hume. He is commonly identified as an empiricist, indeed as an especially clear case of what radical empiricism is. Ironically, that has contributed to thinking of Hume and Hegel as having nothing to do with one another. And indeed, Hegel is thought of this kind of idealist where everything is spirit and it's all just mind. And sure, there's some kind of truth to that. But the issue is that how Hegel understands mind is how I like to think about as nature and notion as two sides of the same coin. You can't really say that it's all just some kind of panpsychic consciousness or something like that. It turns out that consciousness is not what we thought it was, that it's a mixture of nature and notion, that there is no talk of mind independent of the concrete. There's no talk of the concrete independent of mind, subject to substance, as we learn in Hegel. Well, that's quite similar to Hume. Subject to substance for Hume. You can never separate subject and substance. You have to think of substance as always mediated through the subject. And it's just the issue is that for Hume, taking seriously the subject, taking the subject seriously is concrete. The subject exists. So to act like the subject doesn't exist is kind of absurd for Mr. Hume. So once you start bridging these differences, you can see how Hegel and Hume can go together. Now, as Livingston likes to frame Hume, a better way to think of Hume than as an empiricist is someone who is radically questioning philosophy. Like, what is philosophy? That's going to get into the tradition of Pyrrhonism, that old classic thought that, Mr. Livingston believes has been basically forgotten. I think that is true. And Hume is part of that, where philosophy is the biggest question of philosophy. And I think that describes Hegel as well. And what Hume realizes is that philosophy has the ability to question everything. And because it can question everything, it doesn't necessarily have to observe the foundation that makes it possible, and that's why it can eat itself, I love the Wittgenstein of uncertainty, and he tells us that indeed, in the action, we cannot question everything. To act, we cannot question everything, and Wittgenstein falls in line with Hume. And likewise, in Hegel, we have to think in every step of what Dr. Lass calls a phenomenological journey, which is a very helpful phrase. We have to experience the limits. Self-consciousness has to experience the limits of self-consciousness to move into reason. Reason has to experience its limits to move into spirit religion. And you can't merely think those limits. You have to experience them. And until you arrive at them, you're not going to sublate those limits into the next phase of the phenomenological journey. And so rationality cannot be its own grounding. It has to experience its limitation and then move from there. So there's parallels there between Hume and Hegel. And I think we see in both of them a exemplification of true and false philosophical theorizing. You could have in Hegel the philosophy that is too much on the side of understanding, one-sidedness, and therefore becomes very problematic. Likewise, in Hume, you can have philosophy that is false philosophy because it does not observe the non-rational foundation that makes it possible. So there are parallels here. Both of these philosophers are going to suggest that the human is a being that is able to believe something that they don't know how they believe. They just believe it. Like the moment they try to rationalize it. Well, here's the problem. Like if with Hume, if you try to ask why do you think common life is authoritative, that answer is the experience of common life. So if you're in a conversation, you can't bring the experience of common life to the conversation. You can only describe it, and therefore the reason won't be there. And so it will seem like there is no reason, and then you may turn on common life, and that's where you get the terrors of the of modern philosophy that Livingston will talk about. You get this totalizing destruction that can occur because nothing can ultimately be its own grounding, and so the critique of philosophy can critique everything, and it totalizes everything in its critique, and you get a lot of trouble from there. And you see, what Mr. Livingston wants to emphasize is that in Hume's treatise, that the great topical distinction is not the empiricist one between the uninterpreted sense impressions and interpretation, but the dialectical distinctions between two sorts of interpretation, custom and reflection. The exploration of this dialectical relationship is the central theme of all Hume's philosophical writing. Indeed, it is not that Hume is trying to show the difference between empiricism and interpretation, but between philosophy that observes reflection and philosophy that observes the necessity of custom and the philosophy that does not and thus eats itself. This is of a great, great concern for Mr. Hume. And again, look, when Hegel is telling us in the Philosophy of Right that the owl of Nineveh, takes flight at dusk, and that philosophy can't be in the service of politics, it has to be in service of interpretation, this sounds a lot like Hume. Philosophy is in the business of interpreting the past and interpreting the present because that changes the mode by which we enter the future and thus changes the future, but it can't change the future directly. Likewise, for Hume, philosophy cannot replace common life but has to observe common life, and in so reflecting, it may improve common life, but it will not replace common life. So you have parallels there between Hume and Hegel yet again. Now, in the book, Philosophical Melancholy, that Livingston himself tells us there is much to be learned from a comparative study of Hume and Hegel. And there's a book, a wonderful book by Dr. Christopher Berry called Hume, Hegel, and Human Nature. And he's bringing those two together. And I think more of this needs to be done. And, Dr. Berry impressively argues that Hume's belief in the constancy and uniformity of human nature aligns with human nature as a concrete universal in Hegel, though also argues that they ultimately have different estimations and conceptions of history. Now again, we're not trying to say Hegel and Hume are identical in their thought, but they have more overlay than differences because they're looking for this space that is in between kind of a hard materialism and a hard abstraction. They're looking for the fact that philosophy is always embodied and embodiment always influences abstraction, but that's dialectical. You can't reduce one to the other. Neither Hume nor Hegel is a relativist, Dr. Berry informs us, noting that for both some concrete material criteria is termed a substantive account of rationality, which is to say that inner options, philosophies, and intellectual differences are not in themselves substantive without relation to materiality, such as geography, environment, so on and so forth. So they're not relativists. What they want to show is that there's always a substantive account of rationality, that an idea is not even an idea unless it's concrete, and the concrete shapes the idea. So we really should not think of these as relativists. There's a sense in which we're dealing with that tragedy that Wittgenstein talks about, where the moment you act, indeed, which I love his wordplay with the I indeed, space between those, indeed, we cannot doubt everything. We have to act, and that brings to mind also Missing Axioms by Samuel Barnes. The moment you act, you're acting with values, even if you don't know how you are. It just, boom, you are. So both Hegel and Hume are going to fall in line, which then, of course, for me, aligns Hume with Hegel, counter-enlightenment, Scottish enlightenment, and then in Hegel, the modern counter-enlightenment, as I like to call it. We can see the through line in all of the thought. Dr. Berry tells us that Hume enunciates his view of human nature in his characterization of the function and premises of historical knowledge. And we must never forget that Hume is a historian, and Hegel does a lot in history, so that's going to probably be another reason why they go together. And what you see is that the philosophy is inseparable from its historic moment. It cannot be divided from it. We have to think the horizon that we are in, and if we try not to, it just leads to trouble. And that's another understanding that Hegel has that's so important. So, overall, we could say for Hume and Hegel that the Enlightenment's understanding of human nature as uniform and constant was contradicted with a concrete, specific understanding, understanding here termed contextualist. So, if you study history, you see some consistency to human beings, but you also aren't going to be able to fall in some sort of Rousseauian or Hobbesian state of nature, that the way human beings form is in response to their material condition, and they're concrete, and you can see some Marxism here. They respond to that. Now, there are some probabilities, there are some likelihoods by which humans respond to certain situations. If there's a lack of food, they can become more violent. If there's an overabundance of comfort, though, they can become lazy or complacent. So there are some human probabilities. So we're not trying to say there's no such thing as human nature, but we also can never describe human nature or human probability independent of the historic moment in which it is situated. That is a massive mistake that both Hegel and Hume are working to correct. So what this would suggest is that context is important. Dr. Berry will stress context, as will Dr. Livingston, and I'll talk about conditionalism, the various conditions that are met that changes how humans respond, the environment they're in. There's that whole paper on conditionalism and reconstructing ASA. And both Hume and Hegel can be thought in terms of context and conditionalism, not in terms of like a relativism. And what ends up happening is this is where it's dialectical, because the conditions that humans imagine and create and think up changes what humans are, which changes what they can imagine, create, and think up, and so on and so forth. It goes back and forth. Nature and notion are indivisibly linked in very, very profound ways. And both of them also suggest that we are able to believe things and be legitimate in that belief, even if we cannot rationally justify them, because they can be part of or from the context in which we are situated. So both of them are really stressing that belief is not always what we think it is. Belief is something that makes philosophy possible. And if philosophy, non-rational belief makes philosophy possible, and if philosophy demands a rational justification for belief, it can end up in auto-cannibalism. Hume will make distinctions, say, between the popular and the popular belief and the philosophical belief. You have Hegel talking about understanding and reflection, one-sidedness, dialectic. And what Hume really understands, he's one of the first in modern times for Dr. Livingston to appreciate the fact that the acceptability of a system is independent of the truth or falsity of its axioms. Considerations of the logical strength of the axioms to generate theorems within the system, and that of the system's relation, logical and otherwise, to other systems are more important than an isolated concern with the semantic properties of the axiom. So what you see here is the distinction between coherence and correspondence. Hume realized philosophy could be coherent and not correspond, and therefore is incredibly dangerous. If I can have a system of thought that is entirely internally consistent, then that might suggest, if I think that means it is true, then I can force the world to conform to that coherent system and thus create a great violence upon the world and be justified in so doing. And this is where I've been reading Mr. Hunter Coates' book on conspiracies and Lacan. And I think conspiracies should be central to our thinking, because a conspiracy is something that we all see as a coherent system. What we all see as a system of thought, we tend to think of it as absurd and stupid, so we don't learn what we should learn from conspiracy, which is that coherence is not correspondence, because conspiracies tend to be really well thought out, and they don't entail any essential contradictions. They could be true. There's nothing in the conspiracy that necessitates their falsity, and yet they don't correspond. And actually what Hume understood is that most philosophical systems, frankly, ideology, worldviews, philosophical products of what he calls, the philosophical consciousness, they just tend to be conspiratorial or internally consistent systems. And the reason why this is very bad is because they're also indestructible. I'll use the phrase, the map is indestructible. And so this is quite dangerous. Once you create a map, following them, you never have to change the territory according to it. You can always just say the territory is wrong. Another great Hume scholar is Norman Kemp Smith, and what he tells us that what we may perhaps describe as the chief aim of Hume's philosophy is to prove that belief rests neither on reason nor on evidence. And that doesn't mean the belief is false, though. But it's also not easy to locate, where do we find the concrete reality or legitimization of the idea that when a coat is draped over a chair, you shouldn't sit in it. And this, of course, alludes to Hayek. Friedrich Hayek is certainly going to be pulling thought from out of the Scottish Enlightenment. And frankly, the Austrian economists tend to be at their best when they are talking about this problem or a lot of this kind of stuff. But so where do we see the concrete law that you should not sit in a chair that has a coat draped over it? We don't see it anywhere, and yet it is concrete. So we can't, and this is what society is mostly run according to, and we can't locate that in terms of reason or evidence. It is purely experience. You can only experience that when a coat is draped over a chair, you shouldn't sit there. You have to experience that. And if that's the majority of the organization of society, if you don't have phenomenological pragmatism, or if you don't have this category of custom as concrete, then you're going to destroy the society for good reason, rationally. This is what Hume understands. And that doesn't mean that you can't negotiate with people on the meaning of a coat draped over a chair. But it does mean that you need to negotiate it, and then you will, the society must come to agree on if we're going to maintain that law or not. So, Hume understood that really reducing thought to either evidence or reason was going to be incredibly destructive. And Hegel has the same insight as well. That's why you have to have the development of spirit through history. History must go through experience. It must experience its limits. It can't merely think its limits. It has to experience them. Because when you think a limit, it's not really a limit yet, because you have a kind of power over it precisely because you can think it. You have to experience it, and you have to experience the limits of your material condition in order to, what is it? Necessity is the mother of innovation and invention. There's a lot of truth to that. So Hume is going to talk about natural belief. And I think we see natural belief operating in Hegel. Another way to put it is that for Hume, you can't ask, do minds exist? Because you require a mind to ask that. You can't ask, is the real world actually real? Because there has to be a real world to ask that question. But philosophy is capable of asking questions like that, which thus eat itself. Are we in a computer simulation? Hume would be terrified by this. We experience the world as not a computer simulation, and you have to assume the world is there in a fashion that makes it real enough to ask if it's a simulation. So this is an auto-cannibalistic question, self-cannibalism. And he wants to say, so for Hume, what Livingston, Smith, all these people want to stress is that the doctrine of natural belief is one of the most essential and perhaps the most characteristic doctrine in Hume's philosophy. And yet we moderns, in not getting that, or just not even having the category of natural belief, we basically just can't interpret Hume correctly because we don't have that category of thought. And arguably, it's also contributed to our inability to understand Hegel, and so we end up just thinking of Hegel as some strange German idealist, which, the Antonio Wolff, whose channel is magnificent, I really enjoy his work, he was talking about we have to think about Hegel as an absolute idealist, but basically that only refers to Hegel, and what does that mean? It's such a unique project that Hegel is engaged in. Well, what Hume is engaged in is such a unique project, and many of the modern counter-Enlightenment thinkers are engaged in incredibly unique projects that, unfortunately, we almost don't even have the categories to think because of how modern philosophy has developed and led us into thinking. So it's quite problematic. Custom, then, is the great guide of human life. It is that principle alone which renders our experience useful to us. But we are in an age in which reason cannot help but feel epistemologically immoral not to search for the reason of custom. Is all this collective conflict of mind, evidence of some evolution of consciousness like discussed by Rudolf Steiner? This does pose the question: is the very realization of absolute knowing more collectively of the problems of absolute skepticism? It raises the question: what does it mean for spirit to reason about the groundlessness of reason? What kind of negation, sublation might this give rise to? So there is something to be said that if we take seriously Hume and Hegel, this could lead to Cadell Lass will talk about the revenge of philosophy. This could lead to a new state of philosophy that goes beyond what seems to be the end of philosophy in neo-pragmatism of Richard Rorty, or some of the postmodernism of Derrida, and there seems to be the possibility of a revival of philosophy here. And so taking this overlap between Hume and Hegel seriously, and then the chain of thought from Vico up through the modern counter-enlightenment, I think is incredibly important. And if we don't, and indeed the sociological condition with the collapse of Gibbons as described in Belonging Again has unleashed philosophical consciousness upon the world, meaning everyone is philosophical now, even if they don't want to be. To survive or to handle this modern situation, it would seem to me that we require philosophy. And if philosophy is off the table because we think it's dead, then we don't have the tool that we require, and we will probably continue to suffer more, the mental health crisis, political extremism, meaning crisis, all these different things. And so let us hope that philosophy may make that comeback. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.